We'll just wait for others to come. All right. Can you all hear me? Can you all hear me?
Yes, Dr.
All right, good. Okay, just a minute. All right, that's a problem from working at home. You're always distracted. All right, anyway, welcome back. Hope you had a good 1 week break. Today, our topic will be on knowledge. Knowledge is, well, simply said, what we know, right? The contents, the know-how, the subject matter, the processes, the procedures, those can all be put into knowledge. So when we organize the bits of information that we have within ourselves and make that into something meaningful for us, then that will be knowledge. Okay. In our discussion today, we are going to discuss about explicit and tacit knowledge. So these are the two forms of knowledge that we deal with in our everyday life. And especially at the workplace, this becomes much more important, right? So we will look into what we mean by tacit and what we mean by explicit knowledge, right? So when we talk about knowledge, we talk about information, right? So information is the one that actually leads to knowledge. And what we know, right, is knowledge is something that we believe to be true and that has been proven to be correct. And it's interesting, right? Because not everything that we assume to be true is knowledge. All right. If I were to say that, no, I use this a lot. Many would believe that it's true that the sun rises from the east, right? Sorry. I'm getting used to this. Okay. If I were to say that the sun rises from the east, would that be true? Anyone? Think about it for a while. Every morning we see, when we look eastwards, then we see that the sun comes up and we say that the sun rises from the east, right? I've used this example before, but the thing is that it's not the sun that is rising from the east, it's the rotation of the earth that makes it looks like the sun rises. The sun is stationary. It stays where it is, but because of the earth's rotation, then we see that apparently the sun rises from the east, but it is not true, right? And that goes into things that we see every day, into what we know and what we hold on to be a belief, right? So each and every one of us would have our own beliefs into what is real, right? And that is our reality. And we consider that to be what we know and hence our knowledge. Now, I believe that most of us, if not all, have tried durians before, right? Now, if I were to show you the durians that we have here, do you know what durians these are? Some of you may be familiar with this type, right? Have you had musang king before? Anyone?
Yes.
Yes, right? Now, if I were to ask you, how would you tell someone who has never had a durian before how the musang king tastes like? You've had the experience of eating musang king, of tasting musang king, and you know that is the knowledge that you have. You know what it tastes like, but try to explain it to someone how the musang king tastes like, right? It would be almost impossible to make sure that that person would have the taste of musang king, no matter how you explain. It is sweet, it is fragrant, it is, it is bitter, it is creamy. You can say all that, you can use all those words. But yet, for that person who has never had the musang king before, would never be able to taste the durian. And this is what we call tacit knowledge. So, according to Polanyi, knowledge can be classified into explicit knowledge and tacit knowledge. And as such, we know more than what we can tell. How does that work out? We know more than we can tell, right? If you can imagine the knowledge inside you, there's so much knowledge, there's so many things that you know. But to be able to tell other people what we know is difficult. We may be able to tell people, for example, how to go to Kuala Lumpur. We may tell people how a durian looks like, right? But in the end, it's back to the person to be able to translate what you are telling the other person. Now, someone who has never seen a banana tree, I think all of you would have seen a banana tree, right? But someone who has not seen a banana tree would imagine that a banana, someone from Europe, for example, who has never seen a banana tree, would imagine that bananas would grow like apples, because the bananas they see are the combs of bananas, not the whole bunch, right? So they would probably draw bananas like having combs of bananas growing on trees like apples, which is what they believe to be, right? Now, the same thing, we've had people, for example, visiting us from America. And when we took them to the rubber plantation and showed them how rubber is planted, they were very surprised. They were very surprised when they saw that the rubber latex was white. Because all this while, when they think about rubber, they would think about tires. And what color are the tires? Tires are black. Never could they imagine that rubber in the form of latex is white, right? So that is an example of how people interpret everything or everyday things. The same thing, right? You have a lot of knowledge. You know a lot of things, but you won't be able to talk about it. You won't be able to tell another person what you actually know. Another example, most of you would know how to ride a bicycle, but to explain to someone who has never ever rode a bicycle how to ride a bicycle would almost be impossible. Try that yourself. I don't think you will be able to teach someone to ride the bicycle just by telling him how to ride the bicycle, right? You probably have to have that person actually sit on a bicycle and then try to ride the bicycle, right? So this is the challenge of knowledge. Now, we have two types of knowledge: explicit knowledge and tacit knowledge. Now, explicit knowledge is simple enough. It is codified knowledge that can be expressed through formal languages, right? No matter what language you have, you will be able to explain it. Like what I am trying to do today, I am trying to make my knowledge, what I know, what knowledge is in terms of explicit and tacit knowledge, into something that could be explained to you. I'm using language. In this case, I'm using the English language to explain what explicit and tacit knowledge is all about, right? So explicit knowledge comes from the explicit, something that can be seen, something that can be heard, right, is explained through language, right? And it is codified. Languages are, after all, codes, right? So it is captured in speech, in written documents, and also in databases. Sorry. So what we say, what we write, right, and what we can access from the database are usually explicit knowledge. They have been transformed into something that can be shared in speech, something that can be spared in written materials, right? The books you read, for example, are knowledge that has been codified and made explicit by the author, okay? So that is what you term as explicit knowledge. Then comes tacit knowledge. Tacit knowledge is personal. Like the example that I gave you, the taste of durian. Only you, right, with your sense of taste, and bear in mind that everyone has a different sense of taste, right? The level of sweetness that someone can taste is different between one person and another. The level of bitterness, the level of saltiness, it all differs between individuals. And that creates that unique taste that each and everyone has. And as such, it is personal, right? And that is why some people like durians and some people just don't like durians. Because of the differences within ourselves, the differences in our senses, the five senses, right? The taste, the sense of taste, the sense of smell, the sense of sight, hearing, right? And feel. Those are different. Now, some people just, when they look at durian, they see it's very soft and feel it, the texture, then they don't like it, right? So all those senses would be translated into taste and how one would respond to the durian. So it is personal. And as such, what we know would be difficult to be formalized, to be made explicit and communicated to someone else. And that is what tacit knowledge is all about. Okay, moving along. So in tacit knowledge, we have, oops, this is very sensitive. Sorry. Let me get this back. Okay. I'm trying to move things around here. Okay, just bear with me. All right. Now, these are some of the tacit knowledge that we have. Number one, we can see tacit knowledge as being having cognitive elements and also technical elements. Now, cognitive elements are elements within our minds, what we can think, right? And this is something that is abstract in nature. Now, we have, for example, mental models. What are mental models? Mental models are what we think about things, what we think about the world, what we think about the things that we see, right? Now, what is happening to the United States today, in the US? There are riots, right? And those riots are caused by how people look at things in the US, right? Now, the blacks in the US, for example, might see that there is a lot of injustice going around, that people of color are usually discriminated, while the whites see that they are actually having more power, that they can control other people, for example, right? So these are the mental models on how we see things, how we look at the world. And as such, we may also call it our worldview, right? And also, some people say our schemata or paradigms and beliefs, or we look at the world through our lenses, right? And of course, each and every one of us looks at the world differently. Why? Because of our own past experiences, we begin to shape our own judgment. We begin to shape our own views of things, right? Now, for example, how easy for someone to get help from someone else? If you have had the opportunity to be helped almost every time, people are willing to help you, then you would have a much more positive view of other people. But if you've had a lot of hard luck, every time you are in need of help, help seldom comes. And as such, your view of the world would be different from someone who has received help all the times, right? So that translates in how one would behave, for example. So just for now, it is a tacit knowledge because our view of the world is different. It is shaped by our past experiences, and that becomes what we believe. And as such, that belief is what is translated into our knowledge, right? We know what will happen. For example, if we were to fall down on the road, now, different people would have different experiences if we were to fall down, right? And that gives us or shapes our belief into how the world works, right? And this is part of the cognitive element. So when we talk about cognitive element, it is generally our own worldview. And then the second part is what we have as technical elements. Now, technical elements are much more know-how, how one does something, right? For example, how do you cook rice? You have your own procedures of cooking rice, right? How you do certain things. How do you catch fish, for example? Now, everyone would have their own way of doing things. How do you draw the face of a person, right? So those are all technical elements talking about procedures, standard operating procedures, right? We talk about McDonald's having certain procedures of doing things, how they make French fries, how they make their burgers. Those are all what you say as standard operating procedures into the work that they have come. And that would be a technical element. How to write a paper, how to write a term paper, how to do an exam. Those can be considered to be technical elements that are captured in the procedures and processes that you do things. Any questions for now? Anyone? So I hope you are able to distinguish or differentiate between what is tacit knowledge and what is explicit knowledge, right? So this is also in line with Anderson's own what he called ACT, right? So he would have declarative knowledge. So that is knowledge that is expressed as propositions. And this would be examples of explicit knowledge, right? On the technical elements, declarative knowledge would be what they would express, explicit knowledge. And then procedural knowledge would be transformed into practice, all right? So in other words, declarative knowledge is what we know, while procedural knowledge is how we implement or how we practice it. Most of you would know how to cook rice. You can tell me, you can explain how you're going to cook rice, right? And that is declarative knowledge. The same thing, how do you bake a cake, right? You have it in your mind how you're going to bake a cake, and then you would transform that into the steps of baking cake. And those steps are what you call procedural knowledge, right? So declarative knowledge are, well, to have a cake, have a cake, you have to have flour, you have to have sugar, you have to have butter, you have to have eggs, right? That is the simple contents of cake. Now, how do you transform sugar, flour, butter, and eggs into a cake? There are certain ways of doing it, right? So you have to put in the flour, you have to put in the butter, you have to put in the sugar, you have to put the eggs, and then you mix them up, right? So that is actually the practice of making a cake, and that is the procedural knowledge of baking a cake. Until after you have reached a certain consistency in the ingredients and they are well mixed, and then you put them in an oven, right? What is the temperature of the oven? You would have some idea. All right, some say it's 180 degrees centigrade, right? So you know how, after you have mixed, then you put it in the oven 180 degrees centigrade. How do you know that the cake is ready? So there is a certain time that takes for the cake to bake. And then people would have techniques of determining whether the cake is ready or not, whether the cake is baked or not, right? And these are all transformed into procedural knowledge, right? The same thing that goes into everything that we do every day, right? We know how to do it, and there is a certain procedure of doing those things, okay? So these are the architecture of cognition. And now we get into something that is much more complex, right? We know there is tacit knowledge, and we know there is explicit knowledge. Now, how do those knowledge, how does the knowledge get transferred from one person to another person, right? So we can put that into a metric that has tacit knowledge and explicit knowledge on both the axes, right? So when we talk about, for example, how tacit knowledge becomes tacit knowledge in another person, right? So in this first case, right, knowledge remains tacit, right? Where it remains personal. Now, how do you put on your tudung, your scarf, for example, among women, right? So the ladies, for example, how do you wear a scarf? Now, this is through socialization, right? You see someone putting on her scarf and you try it out, right? The person did not explain how to put on the scarf, but you, as a result of observing the person wearing the scarf, try to do the scarf, try to wear the scarf, right? The same thing about, for example, eating using chopsticks, right? You probably watch someone using the chopsticks and then you try it out yourself, right? You watch a lot of things in your life. People who smoke cigarettes, for example, there has never been a class on smoking, but yet people learn how to smoke cigarettes. How do they learn to smoke cigarettes? By watching another person smoke a cigarette, and as such, they are able to copy the action of smoking a cigarette. And this is what you call socialization, right? You socialize, you watch someone, you are interacting with someone without even having to speak, right? You just watch, right? How do you, for example, why do you wear the clothes that you wear, for example, right? It's because you are within a certain social situation, and as such, you learn how to wear the clothes the way that is worn within the culture, right? The Malays, for example, wear songkok, right? But then we also see, for example, some Africans now wearing the songkok. How do they know how to wear the songkok or where to put the songkok on? To put that when they see a songkok, they know that the songkok is to be put on the head, right? And how do they know that? That is socialization. And in socialization, tacit knowledge is transferred to someone and remains as tacit knowledge, right? And then the next one, where tacit knowledge, from explicit knowledge becomes tacit knowledge, right? So you have explicit knowledge. And what are some examples of explicit knowledge? Books, for example, are knowledge that has been made explicit. What do you do with books? You read the books, right? And as such, when you read, then you are actually internalizing explicit knowledge, and that explicit knowledge becomes your tacit knowledge. It becomes your personal knowledge, right? So the transfer of explicit knowledge into tacit knowledge in anyone, in an individual, is called internalization, where you internalize explicit knowledge, making that explicit knowledge your personal knowledge, right? And that is called internalization. And then the same thing, externalization, like what I am doing, I have tacit knowledge that is made explicit. I am making my tacit knowledge explicit in the sense that I am explaining my tacit knowledge in words. I am using language to turn my tacit knowledge into explicit knowledge, right? So I have tacit knowledge here, and I am making it explicit by externalization. What is examples of externalization? By explaining something using language, which is a code in itself, to explain. And also, for example, tacit knowledge, if I were to write a book, right? Now, writing a book is transforming my tacit knowledge, what I know personally, into something that is explicit. The words that I write down are actually explicit in nature. So this is called externalization. And finally, we have a combination where explicit knowledge remains explicit, right? It does not become someone's personal knowledge. It remains as explicit knowledge. What is an example? When you input data or when you input information in a database, right? So you have explicit knowledge, that explicit knowledge, that information which is explicit in nature is transformed into something that is still explicit, right? People don't make it, taste it. It remains as explicit, right? So when you transfer explicit knowledge, data into a database, that is an example of combination, right? The knowledge does not become tacit, but remains explicit. So these are the four modes of transferring knowledge or translating knowledge: tacit to tacit, socialization; tacit to explicit is externalization, where you externalize the knowledge. Sorry. This thing is a bit too sensitive. All right. I got to be very careful that I don't press too hard. Okay. Sorry, guys.
Okay, Doctor.
Okay. So socialization, internalization, and combination, right? So these are the four types of how a knowledge get transformed from one type to another. Any questions so far, anyone? Are you all okay? All right then.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, Doctor.
Okay, yeah.
Yes, Doctor.
So we'll move on.
Okay.
I'll just show everything here. All right. So when we are at work, right? Because when we are talking about the learning organization, it's about how the organization learns, right? And how people within organization learns, and how the learning of individuals, of people within the organization gets transformed into knowledge at the organization level, right? So the simple mode is when we have theory. Theory talks about what our concepts are, how we explain certain things, right? So we have, for example, we go to the mama shop, we know how the mama makes roti canai, for example. That is theory. What is and how, right? How do you make good teh tarik, for example? What is the theory behind a good teh tarik? You must have good tea leaves. You must put the tea leaves or infuse the tea leaves in hot water. Must always be above 95 degrees centigrade, for example, right? And then you mix with condensed milk and probably add a little bit of evaporated milk. And most shops or most mama shops would add a little bit of salt in the tea. That is theory. What makes a good teh tarik? And that theory is actually put into practice. How they do teh tarik and serve teh tarik to the clients, to the customers at the mamak shop, right? And there is always that reflection, right? How much milk should be put in teh tarik? How do you stir? How many times should you pull the tea, right? So when you, for example, have one very good tea, how do you make that very good tea? Right? You try all the ways, the methods of making good tea. And finally, you come to one that is perfect. And you reflect what makes that tea good, right? The same thing, you cook a dish, you make, for example, curry, right? And suddenly, that curry tastes very good. And you reflect on it. What makes the difference? So there's always theory, what is and how something is done, the explanation of doing something, and then the practice, the actual doing. And then whenever something fails or is successful, then you reflect on it. Why did it fail? Or why was it successful? And this is what work-based learning, right? So in most, if not all organizations, these things are put into play. There's theory, how to and what is, the practice, the actual doing, and then the reflection to think about why something happened or why something works, why something fails. So theory, practice, and reflection is what work-based learning is all about. And you see in all organizations, right, successful campaigns, for example, successful sales, successful marketing. There's always theory in marketing. And then you practice that theory, and then you begin to reflect. Why did it work this time? Why did it fail this time? So these are the learning that happens at work. All right? And as such, I hope I did not miss, let me check. Okay? Now, when we talk about explicit knowledge and tacit knowledge, right, we have what we call the spiral of organization knowledge creation. We take into account the four modes of learning, remember? Socialization, combination, externalization, and internalization. And that happens in a group level, right? At the group level, at the individual level, at the group level, at the organization level, and at the inter-organization level. Now, this looks at how organizations learn, going through the transformation of tacit knowledge into explicit knowledge. And we must remember that both tacit is transformed into explicit knowledge, and explicit knowledge is also transformed into tacit knowledge. That happens all the time, where knowledge is transformed from tacit to explicit and explicit into tacit. But what happens here, we were discussing mostly at the individual level, right? But when we look at the organization level, then you grow through a group process, you grow through an organization process, and you also go through an inter-organization process where knowledge is actually transferred from one organization into another organization. And this happens, for example, in industries, right? The food industry, right? You have McDonald's, you have Burger King, you have what other? All those selling burgers, for example, right? You have Wendy's. I don't know in Malaysia whether we still have Wendy's. And then you have Arby's. You have A&W. And these are all fast food selling burgers. And do they learn inter-organization? Yes, they do, right? They look at their competitors, they benchmark against their competitors, and they learn from other organizations. And this is where knowledge gets transformed between organizations, right? So Nonaka and Takuchi, right, talks about this spiral, how knowledge continually is changed from tacit to explicit within individuals, group, organization, and inter-organization, right? And sorry, okay? And as those things happen, right? For example, at the individual level and also at the group level, people socialize. And when they socialize, they transform tacit knowledge into explicit knowledge. Tacit knowledge into tacit knowledge. So this part is still within the tacit knowledge where people socialize. And that is happens at probably individual primarily and within groups and also within organization, right? But inter-organization and organization, probably that tacit knowledge is internalized, right? As much as the explicit knowledge when this is internalized, when that knowledge becomes part of the organization, right? So that knowledge is actually internalized. And combination, we look at explicit knowledge, remaining explicit knowledge within electronic means, within databases, within conferences or publications that are passed on from one organization to another, right? And also there are externalizations where that this doesn't work well for me. Where sorry guys, it's too sensitive. Okay, where that knowledge remains, or where explicit knowledge is actually made. Sorry, when tacit knowledge is made into explicit knowledge, right? So this is when those knowledge is externalized and transferred into organization. All right. So we will not delve too much on this, but this is how knowledge. Now we remember when we talked about theory and practice just now, and that explicit and tacit knowledge and learning, theory and practice, right? So when knowledge is turned into theory, then that is conceptualized, right? So theory made explicit or explicit knowledge turns into theory is what we call conceptualization, right? So we conceptualize, for example, what makes a car faster? And for example, we talk about Formula One. You are going to race cars. And to race cars, you have to make the car faster. And this is how you turn that theory into explicit knowledge by explaining that for cars to travel fast but still do not slip off the road, then the car needs to be pushed down, right? So that will ensure that the car, especially the tires, will have better grip on the road surface. How do you make sure that cars have better grips on the on the road surface, although they're traveling fast? Number one, you need to have a downforce, right? So something must push the car down so that it sticks on the road surface. How do you push the car down so that it remains on the surface? So this is where they have their those wings on the cars. So when air passes over those wings, right, then the car gets pushed down, right? So that's one thing. That's the theory. That's the concept of making cars remain on the ground with good grips. That is the concept of cars with good grips. What's the other one? Well, they look at it. What is the only contact between the car and the road surface? Is the tires, right? How do you make sure that the tires have good grip on the road? Number one, it must be made of good material. So they have tires that can actually grip on the road. Number two, that the theory says that the wider the surface, the better the grip. And that is the concept of having racing tires that are very wide. So this goes on with anything that we look at, right? There's a theory of it, and that theory is made explicit, and this is what you actually conceptualize that knowledge and that theory. All right? And then you have experimentation, where theory is actually tacit or turned into tacit, where you actually try out things, right? Does this work? Or what does work? And that is actually in the form of a tacit knowledge. And people, the mechanics of Formula One would have that idea, right? That tacit knowledge of what works. In tuning the cars, for example, right? To make sure that the engine runs smoothly, that there is enough air that is mixed with the fuel. Now, how do you make sure that the mixture of air and fuel is correct, right? So they have that tacit knowledge to know the exact amount, right? How do they actually balance the suspension so that the cars, when they corner, they don't overturn? That is tacit knowledge that is done through experimentation. By tweaking, they call it tweaking, right? By refining certain things, right? And then how explicit knowledge is turned into practice, that is through reflection, right? So you have that explicit knowledge, you reflect on it. People say, well, to make good bread, you have to knead the dough, right? How do you knead the dough? How long do you knead the dough, right? Or bake. And all right, there are lots of things. For example, how do you make good cakes? How do you make good biryani, right? There are explicit knowledge on how to make biryani, but you actually do that in practice and reflect on it, and that improves the biryani, right? Now, by practice, by doing something, you actually would develop experience. So we must remember that experience is actually a result of turning practices into tacit knowledge, right? If it is still theory, then you are actually experimenting. But when you actually do something, right? How do you ride a bicycle? It's actually an experience that turns that practice into tacit knowledge, right? So this is the individual level work-based learning. How each and everyone learn knowledge, right? Making theory explicit, making theory tacit, making practice explicit, and making making practice tacit, right? So if I were to ask you, how do you make theory explicit? You conceptualize, right? So when you conceptualize, then you are actually turning theory into explicit. That's why we have concepts, right? What is the concept of a racing car? A racing car is a car that goes fast because it has a powerful engine and it has a good grip on the road. That is the concept of a good racing car, right? What's the theory of a racing car that goes very fast? You would experiment, right? You need to have something that push down, you change the angle of the aerofoil and so on, and that would balance out between the grip and also the speed, because too much grip would make the car slower. But too little, when we're talking about downforce, too much downforce would cause the car to be slower, and too little downforce would make the car to have less grip, right? So these are the things that we play about in between learning and knowledge, right? So that would be at the individual level. Then we would have the collective level, right? At the collective level, we have the same things: theory, practice, explicit, and tacit, right? And what we have when we have theory that is made explicit, that is called applied science. How we apply the theory into something that is explicit. Applied science would be for something like engineering, right? Engineering is an applied science. They tell you what needs to be applied, or what needs to be had, what needs to be present in a fast car, right? So food sciences is an applied science. Agriculture is an applied science, right? How do you make sure that the tree bears fruits, or the tree starts to fruit at a certain time? How do you make sure that the tree or the plant is disease-free, right? How do you control insects and diseases? And that is an applied science that has theory that is made explicit. So you will have textbooks about agriculture, you would have textbooks about engineering, and that is a collective level at the work-based learning, right? In action learning is about doing things, right? So when we do things, we learn from that. And that theory, we are actually transforming theory into tacit knowledge at a group level, right? Together, we learn about things, right? McDonald's learns about how to make good burgers, right? So if you look at, for example, McDonald's burgers, they have different layers. Where do they put the vegetables? Where do they put the tomato? Where do they put the lettuce? Where do they put the meat? And where do they put the sauces? And where do they put the pickles? Right? That is actually something that is very subjective in the beginning, right? So you have theory, and people know how to actually make good burgers. And you see cooks, for example, or chefs that know how to make good food, that they have some theory about how things work and what needs to work, and they have that tacit experience, right? So if you look at restaurants have certain way of doing things, right? Then they have the practice. It is put into practice. The standard operation procedures, that will be action science, right? So at both the explicit level, we have the sciences. right? And then at the practice, right? For example, um, football players, right? Football players are community of practice. They would have tacit knowledge. Each as a team, they would have tacit knowledge on how to win a game in practice. And they together, each football team and football teams in the league are what we call community of practices. They have certain knowledge about how to do things, how to play football, right? There's a tactical aspect of it, and there are the skill aspect of it, and how to balance that tactics and skill aspects. Those are the teams tacit knowledge in practice. So they are actually community of practice. And as we look at our everyday lives, we see lots of community of practice. So any group of people that share or that operates within certain industry is a community of practice, right? We have, for example, ONG, right? Oil and gas community of practice. And oil and gas community of practice comprise of all those big oil companies, Shell, ExxonMobil, Petronas, and so on, right? They are actually a community of practice. They have certain knowledge and capabilities of drilling oil, of getting oil from the sea, of getting oil from the ground, refining the oil, and making the oil into fuel, making the oil into lubricants. That is actually their community of practice. Oh, just a moment. Oh, take up. Wait, didn't call. All right. So this is basically pretty much how learning and knowledge within a group. So collective meaning together, right? How we change, how we learn and make things into knowledge and learning into knowledge. All right. Finally, we have organization culture, which we will talk about also later, right? So culture, culture is actually shared assumptions about things within a group of people, right? We have our own culture within organizations. For example, how we do things and how we believe things should be done within organization, right? Banks have certain ways, and each bank would have its own culture. And that culture is actually comprised of three levels. And this will be discussed later in our next class, organization culture. We have artifacts, right? Artifacts are those that can actually be seen by the naked eye. And this includes all materials, all equipment, all the tools that are being used. This includes all the behaviors that people have, how people dress, how people talk, right? So anything that we can see with our naked eye are actually artifacts. And those artifacts are actually the result of espoused values, right? Values are things that we consider to be worthwhile. Values are things that we consider to be important, right? Honesty is a value, right? Why is it a value? Because some people, right, or actually most people, consider honesty to be important, honesty to be worthwhile, and that is a value. And when those values are actually told, those values are actually reminded, people say you must be honest, right? You must have integrity. You must use the correct way of doing things, right? Now, those are the values that are being told, that are being expressed, that are being made important and emphasized. And as such, those are what you would call espoused values. Espoused means to be able to communicate, to be able to convey to other people, right? Saying that those values are what we think to be important in our organization. And then the third part are the underlying assumptions. Underlying assumptions are, for example, are the beliefs about things. We assume that honesty is good. Honesty, why is honesty good? Because when you are honest, then people will trust you, right? That is the assumption behind why honesty is important, or why hard work is important, right? So hard work is actually a value. Why is it a value that is being espoused? Because you have certain assumptions about hard work. To be successful, you need to work hard. And as such, there's no shortcut to success apart from hard work. So in our next class, we will be talking about organization culture. That will be the end of our class, or at least my explanation for today. Any questions? Anyone?
No, sir.
Yes?
Clear, sir. Clear.
All right, you can go through. And if you want, you can read up on all this. Just Google, right? Spiral of knowledge, or Tacit knowledge, or Nonaka and Tekuchi, right? I put all this on our Putra Blast, so you may look at it, right? And if you have any questions, you may email, or we can have our WhatsApp discussion, right? So feel free to ask questions, although you may not be able, it's not as, asking questions on online through Zoom here is not very easy, but you can have questions, and we can also discuss in our WhatsApp group, right? So feel free to ask questions. All right?
Okay. Thank you, doctor.
Okay, thank you. If there's nothing else,
Thank you,
then
Doctor.
we will.
Thank you, Doctor.
Okay,
Thanks,
bye.
Doctor.
Thank you, doctor. Thank you, doctor.
Bye-bye,
Thank you,
everyone.
Doctor.
Yes.
Welcome, doctor.
Thank you, Doctor.
So next week about the same time, right? Bye.
Thank
you, Doctor.
Assalamualaikum, doctor. Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
Doctor. Okay.
Thank you,
Bye.
Doctor. Selamat Raya.
Selamat
Selamat Raya,
Raya.
doctor.
We'll
Selamat Raya,
meet again
doctor.
next week at the same time, and we'll discuss organization culture. Please remind me.
Okay, Doctor.
Okay,
Bye.
doctor. Bye. Assalamualaikum.
Salam. Yeah.
Doktor, nanti doktor share link video ni.
Ya, ya. Yang lepas ada
Ah.
kan?
Ada.
Okey, nanti kan saya share. Ni hari ni saya tak lupa rekod.
Okey,
Dia
terima kasih.
lepas saya tutup tu dia ambil masa untuk apa? Untuk dia organisekan.
Okey, okey.
Okey. Bye. Saya nak tutup.
Okey.
Bye.
Bye, doktor.